thank you all for joining us today. For today's conversation, my name is Kwame Marfo from Komodo, and I'll jump into some introductions in a bit. But you're here for the webinar today on generating richer insights before and after the trial with real-world data, partnered or delivered by Komodo and Datavant. Again, pretty excited for you all to join us today. So let's jump into the agenda. There are a few things we are going to go over today. We're going to start with some introductions of myself and the two speakers I have that will be joining me for the conversation today. And then we're just going to jump straight into it and share a few thoughts on how we are combining to offer a new service, some new technology to the segment, to the industry today to allow for generating richer insights with real-world data. We'll take a deeper dive into how this technology and offering can be deployed with some case studies, and then it'll be time for you to ask us questions. To that point, feel free to ask questions throughout the entire presentation and discussion, but we are definitely carving out a good amount of time at the end of our discussion to really get into your questions specifically. But feel free to ask those questions through the Q&A button that you see on your screen. So with that, we'll jump into the introductions. I'll first start off by introducing myself again. My name is Kwame Marfo. I am the General Manager for Clinical Development at Komodo Health. I sometimes like to describe myself as a wandering chemical engineer. Prior to Komodo, I actually spent time in the biotech industry, supporting large-scale manufacturing sciences, and then eventually supporting clinical operations, specifically insights and analytics. And today I'm joined by Ivy and Vera, and I'll first let Ivy introduce herself, and then we'll go to Vera.
Hi, my name is Ivy. I head up the clinical development and RWE practice here at Komodo Health. I'm a doctor by training with deep analytics experience on the payer, provider, life sciences side. I'm very focused on partnering with our life sciences clients and partners like Datavant to drive this transformation in R&D.
Excellent. And hi, everyone. I'm Vera Muchay. I'm Chief Scientific Officer at Datavant. My team here oversees research and solutioning around how healthcare data connectivity can unlock a number of insights, including in clinical development use cases. I'm a cancer researcher by training, so I see that our panel today is very science-focused, and I'm personally very excited about our expanded Komodo partnership in trials. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation, so thanks, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you for those introductions. The team actually got together earlier this week to record our discussion and minimize the risk of my dog jumping up to bark and disrupting. So we're actually going to share that discussion with you. It's just 15 minutes, but feel free to ask questions throughout the discussion, and then we'll join back live to take your questions directly. Studies are being initiated. At the last count I saw in 2021, there were over 5,500 clinical trials that were started. Again, this is started. This doesn't account for the ones that were already active. And as you can imagine, there's a wealth of data being generated within these clinical trials. But then also real-world evidence and real-world data is making its way into the clinical trial landscape as well. So I'm curious if Vera and Ivy, if you could maybe start with sharing some opening thoughts around what you're seeing customers do with real-world data within clinical development. We can start with you, Ivy, and then we'll jump to Vera.
Yeah, I think I've seen three key shifts. One is in how real-world evidence is used strategically. Second, around hybrid trials or meeting patients where they are. And then also around diversity and inclusion. So what we're noticing is that real-world evidence is no longer treated as a backup to evidence that's generated from RCTs, but a key element in strategic discussions from the very outset. Second, innovation around trial design to accelerate time to market. Sponsors are always seeking to make trials run faster and improving that experience for patients. And then lastly, we've seen this improvement in terms of addressing inequities, including finding disparities in outcomes, addressing those gaps in care, and building much more diverse clinical trials.
That's great. Vera, what are you seeing from your end in terms of what customers within the life science spaces are doing with real-world data in clinical development?
So our clients want to make decisions with complete data, the right data in the right place at the right time, despite us living in a fragmented data world. And this availability of connected, complete data will help with making those decisions. Ivy just mentioned some unmet needs quite well there, and I would second all of those. In terms of use cases for these complete connected data, we see a lot of use cases in natural history studies and pragmatic studies, long-term follow-up and long-term evidence generation, and in particular in trial tokenization, which we'll be talking about today.
Thanks for those opening remarks from both of you. So Vera, I'll jump to you. I'm curious, has it always been this way? Historically, has this been possible? What's been the data landscape, architecture landscape within clinical trials and clinical development?
Yeah, so if we're thinking about this whole idea of, how do we make sure that we can make every decision in healthcare with data, and that including the most complete and longitudinal data that you can have on any patient population, and you translate that to the classical clinical trial, the classical RCT, within the trial itself, historically, actually, randomized controlled trials are the gold standard for complete data collection and analysis. Every drug that comes to market that comes through a clinical trial process does so with very robust data. But one thing that's been missing in the past is this connection to that patient population and what happens to them before the trial and after the trial. So there's very important data that is found in that connection. And if we're thinking about the clinical trial of the past, despite it serving as the foundational evidence for this efficacy and safety studies, the limitations of the clinical trial are pretty well documented. And I would say they include things like the delayed discovery of underlying conditions, such as disease progression and other clinical factors that might have rendered a patient actually ineligible for the trial to begin with. There's also the flip side of it. How do we ensure that we get a more diverse and more representative trial population? When we're running a trial, there might be inadequate data to contextualize any adverse events that might be happening in the trial that you can really control for. And then finally, if you're thinking about this observation period after the trial is completed, usually the trial itself could have an observation period that's too small to establish that long-term impact of the clinical outcomes. And once the trial is complete, in the past, you'd often lose that relationship to the overall health of that patient population. So there's immense insight in getting that information from before the trial and after the trial, and doing that incorporation in a way that does not disrupt the trial would be actually very powerful.
Thanks for sharing those thoughts. So Ivy, are we still in this old world? Have things progressed? It'd be great to hear your perspectives on where we stand today.
I think the recent advances in data connectivity and advanced analytics really allow this real-world data to be employed in new ways. And the success will depend on building the right framework and capabilities. So I think the future really is now, because there's a substantial opportunity to capitalize on this large volume of collected real-world data, before the trial, during the trial, and after the trial, that will really help us reduce uncertainties across the development lifecycle and also increase the focus on what treatments work for whom in real clinical practice. And what we can do, is to thread the needle between the historical data and also post-trial data. So as you can see here, we've identified 6 key use cases where leveraging real-world data, we can use it for asset acceleration, optimizing protocols, site selection. And during the trial, as we're collecting all of the information from RCTs, we can actually also build external control arms and also leverage this data post-trial for long-term follow-up as it relates to safety, efficacy, and label expansion. And all of these use cases are made possible because we are able to link disparate data sources, clinical trial data, to claims, to EHRs, to augment the traditional use cases.
So we've talked a lot about the connectivity that's necessary to enable this. So it'd be great, Vera, to share some thoughts here and even maybe speak specifically about Datavant's role in this.
Absolutely. So Ivy just gave a view of, the trial of now and the trial that we want to envision in the future, which is a trial that's connected between the clinical trial data and the real world data about the same trial participants. So I kind of want to talk about the operational of how this happens. But before I do so, I'm sure that the audience here today probably already appreciates this definition, but I'll throw it out there anyway. What is real world data? Real world data, as defined in various places, is any healthcare data that is collected as part of routine interactions of that patient with healthcare that is outside of the randomized controlled trial. So if you're thinking about bridging clinical trial data to real world data, there's really this ecosystem of real world data, be it electronic health record data, claims, labs, genomic, consumer data, other data assets that could be connected into the clinical trial. And I know Ivy will talk a lot about how Komodo's healthcare map is one-stop shop for a lot of that data. But how do you make that data linkable to the clinical trial data? This is where Datavant's technology comes in. If you're thinking about the Datavant token as a universal patient ID, as a universal patient key for that connectivity, we provide the technology that allows any researcher to be able to know that patient 1, 2, 3 in one data set and patient 4, 5, 6 in another data set are the same individual without needing to know who that individual is. So it's a way to do privacy preserving record linkage. So how does that translate into the clinical trial? Once patients are being enrolled into a clinical study, as you know, their personally identifiable information is removed, they get assigned a subject ID, which has a very meaningful meaning in the clinical trial. It follows the patients throughout the trial. What Datavant's technology is allowing us to do right now is to also assign Datavant tokens as part of that process. And those tokens do have that meaning in the real world because Datavant tokens can be used as a linking tool to the rest of the real world data. So now at this point, by utilizing technology at the clinical trial to tokenize those patients, and by utilizing that same technology to build healthcare data assets, such as those that power Komodo's healthcare data map, you can bridge those two worlds in a pretty simple way seamlessly through what we're calling here trial tokenization.
That's very, very impressive. So Ivy, to you, now we live in a world where this connectivity and data can be linked. It'd be great to hear your thoughts on exactly what to link that data to and how that could generate some rich insights.
Yeah, I think that, it is becoming more and more important to create rich data ecosystems that can foster evidence generation, where one can then build data pipelines across multiple assets at scale. So kind of piggybacking off of what Vera said, this technology in conjunction with Datavant connected to Komodo's healthcare map has unlocked this capability where we can see these patients that are screened and randomized, and Komodo can then provide the full retrospective history and also the prospective data collection beyond the trial. So what Komodo Health does very well is in bringing best-in-class data, administrative claims enriched with EMR, omics, lab results, social determinants of health to create sophisticated insights that are fit for purpose across the patient journey. So this healthcare map that we've created tracks the longitudinal journey of 330 million US lives, where we can see every single clinical encounter fully de-identified. And in conjunction with Datavant, this really empowers our life sciences customers to explore the possibilities beyond what was traditionally available.
That's great. So now let's jump into some actual case studies. We've talked about the technology and the offering and what can be possible, but it'd be great to give this a little bit more context for customers and others to really understand where this could go. Now, I appreciate there are multiple case studies and opportunities here. We probably only have time for 2, so we're going to talk about 2. So it'd be great to hear one from you, Ivy, and another from you, Vera, to wrap up this initial conversation.
Yeah, we want to highlight a case study around building external control arms. So much of the recent literature on RWE has focused on potential use cases around product approvals in oncology or rare diseases based on single arm trials with external control arms. So many clinical trials in rare disease are conducted with very few patients, which translates to insufficient statistical power, or they're performed as single arm trials that make it very difficult to compare against other therapeutic options without synthetic control methods. And similarly, in oncology, we're moving towards a very personalized world where certain therapeutics will be most efficacious for a well-determined small patient subset who frequently also have poor prognoses. So because of that, it's ethically and operationally useful to consider an external control arm created for real-world data from real-world data. So kind of how this would work is first, we will be able to tokenize the trial arm, and separately, we'll be able to build an external control arm using real-world data through propensity score methodology. And there's always a question around privacy and entity resolution with de-identified patients. So what Komodo's healthcare map does, it is looks at individual patient level data that's anonymized. Using this Datavant token, which is the 44-character hash, we have strong entity resolution into the individual patients to ensure that there's no double counting across different data assets as separate individuals. Then also with our payer complete data assets, we are capturing every single clinical encounter, because we also want to make sure that patients in the ECA are not the same as the patients in the trial arm. So because both arms are tokenized with this Datavant token, we're able to ensure consistency. Ultimately, this allows our sponsors to avoid having to increase the size of their clinical trial. It drives significant time and cost savings while providing an unprecedented view into these patient populations while maintaining patient privacy.
It's clear there's so many benefits here. This is fantastic to hear and discuss more. Vera, I'll turn it back over to you to close out with your take on a case study.
Sure, happy to. So we talked about creating sort of the parallel external control arm and using linkage and deduplication methods to improve research outcomes that way. I wanted to also talk about the use case of the long-term follow-up. And I'll define sort of like two versions of long-term follow-up as I speak through this. But as we're thinking about certain studies where the trial could be going on for, let's say, a year and a half, but the endpoints of the trial and the continued safety and efficacy needs to be measured for much longer. Think, some of the novel therapies such as cell and gene therapy, or studies like those done in oncology where overall survival is a long-term follow-up. It would be very interesting and actually very impactful to be able to follow the clinical trial population in the long run, even after the trial is completed. So the case study that I'd like to talk about here looks at a patient population that went through a clinical study for about 24 weeks. The trial was tokenized, and linkage there was happening after the trial is completed to Komodo data to look at some outcomes that could be found in claims data. So there's two types of long-term follow-up that I'd like to discuss here as opportunities. There's obviously the long-term safety and efficacy follow-up, which could be going on for 5 to 15 years down the line, as some of these studies require. But there's also the shorter long-term follow-up, in a way, an extension of your clinical trial insights. Even 6 months down the line, you can be able to see, first of all, that your control population, how your control population and your intervention population are doing in the real world. Are we getting patients in the standard of care control population switched to the new intervention, first of all? Are both arms staying on the new therapeutic? If so, why? If not, why not? There's a lot of insights that you can get with that type of long-term follow-up, even in the short run.
Fantastic. Thank you all for joining us for that discussion. And again, going back to understanding the landscape and how much there's so much activity. Like 5,500 clinical trials started last year. Not were registered or ongoing. There were 5,500 clinical trials that were started. So again, imagine a world where a lot of the trial information, the trial data is connected into real world data to generate much more rich insights. I think there's so much potential. So we're back live. I would say thank you for your engagement. Again, please ask your questions with the Q&A button at the bottom. We do have some questions that are coming in. So This is the time where the floor is somewhat yours as participants to ask away. So we're actually going to jump into the first question that came in, and then we'll jump into the others. So the first one I'll actually direct to you, Vera. Does this tokenization have to occur when the subject IDs are created? Can completed trials actually be tokenized? I love this question. So Vera, maybe you can share your initial thoughts, and then Ivy will see if you want to add anything else.
Absolutely, happy to. So that is a question at the core of the operational feasibility of generating a de-identified token. So essentially, if you think about it, those tokens can be generated wherever the personally identifiable information of the trial participant is available, so the PII, to make the token. And that can happen for both ongoing trials, as you're enrolling the patients. That's probably the easiest, most operationally feasible place to do it. That's why we talk about, when a subject ID is added and when you have the patient enrolling in the trial as one place to tokenize. But it can also happen for historical or completed clinical trials, as long as the sites or your CROs or your trial vendors have the ability to generate the tokens, which in a way is saying having the ability to have access to the personally identifiable information for making the token. There's a couple of other operational feasibility questions and a couple of sort of strategic questions as well around getting the patient consents. One thing that I would note is that in the end, the connectivity between the clinical trial data and the real world data that we're talking about today happens in a certified de-identified manner as defined by HIPAA. So the interesting thing there, as we're talking especially for US data, is that de-identified data can be used for secondary research. Our recommendation is wherever you have the ability to connect with your trial participant, even if the data is combined as de-identified, ask for their consent, essentially. In many cases, this consent might already be as part of your ICF form for secondary research. For historical trials, there's some complexity because you might not be able to access or to connect with those patients anymore, neither you nor your CROs nor anybody else. So we've asked this question to a couple of IRBs, and their recommendation has been, again, if you have the ability to ask for consent, do so. If a trial is completed and you're unable to do so, as long as you ensure that the data is certified, de-identified, and used for certain types of secondary research questions, then tokenization is still possible. So happy, for anybody who's interested, happy to kind of like go into detail on both the operations and the consent process offline after this webinar.
Thank you for that, Vera. Ivy, any additional thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I think so. If you're able to tokenize a completed trial today, then we at Komodo Health, we can immediately complete an overlap to the Komodo data to see the insights in real time, about that patient population in a de-identified, privacy preserving way. So similarly, the observational data after the clinical trial closes can be linked to understand post-trial outcomes.
Thanks for that. So we have some other questions that I think are getting deeper into the tokenization technology, which is 100% understandable, and I love this because I'm sure panel participants will really benefit from this detail. So Vera, back to you. Sometimes subjects go from trial to trial. How do you assure that the same subject doesn't receive two different tokens?
Great. Also an excellent question. And again, it goes back to the tokenization technology. So as I mentioned, the tokens are generated from an individual's personally identifiable information. They're hashed and encrypted in a way that you cannot go back to that information, but you're still able to know that patient 1, 2, 3 in a trial and patient 4, 5, 6 in another trial or in the real world or wherever are the same individual. So essentially the technology is in such a way that you can, you're following the same individual because their same information is used to create the token.
Thanks for that. So we're going to jump into another question here. Maybe Vera, back to you. Sorry to put you a little bit on the hot seat, but could you speak to some of the operational considerations here? Anything additional to highlight? And even speak to maybe how quickly you've seen this technology be deployed.
Right. So as I mentioned, the same technology has been used to de-identify and link real-world data. The technology that's used to link the various data sets at Komodo is used in the clinical trials itself. The difference in operations is, again, there's a very specific, relatively small patient population that is undergoing sort of the operations of getting into a trial. So what we try to do is to deploy the Datavant technology wherever is the most feasible as part of the trial process without disrupting the trial itself. I'm sure this audience doesn't need me to kind of like appreciate how timelines in clinical trials are super important. Getting a drug to market a month faster could mean life and death for certain patient populations. So we want to make sure that tokenization is happening in the most feasible place possible. So in terms of operations, again, we've seen multiple places where tokenization can happen, but most of the common one that we see is as the patients are being enrolled, either tokenization happens at the clinical trial sites, where there's a very small lightweight tool where the information can be input to generate the tokens, or it can happen in batch wherever a trial vendor is, let's say, for example, administering e-consents or another place where the personally identifiable information can be accessed and then the patient can consent. In terms of speed, again, the token itself is made in second. The process, even at the site to input the information, press submit, and the token to be stored in a safe place is sort of a 1 to 2 minutes type of process.
Amazing. Thank you for that. So Ivy, we're going to jump to you now. So there's a question around the match rate. So what's a typical match rate that one might expect in claims data sources, or maybe even the Komodo or Komodo's underlying data? Can you speak to that?
Mm-hmm. The match rate depends on the claims data source that you're using and how representative that claims data source is. So at Komodo, we have the largest closed claims asset in the US, where we work with over 150 payers, so 330 million US lives, and 165 million are fully closed, where we see every single clinical encounter. So in the overlaps that we have done with Datavant, the overlap is incredibly high, around over 90 to 95% match rate, because at Komodo, we do capture census level representation. It's a great question, and it's something that sponsors should interrogate, because this breadth and depth of the data is required in order for us to glean meaningful insights. And there's another thing around timeliness, where we get our 50 million feeds daily and we're able to deliver this in near real time. And that's incredibly important when we want to use this for long-term follow-up.
Thank you for that, Ivy. So we're going to jump to another question. Sorry, as I'm gathering my bearings here. All right, cool. So let's do this one. So Vera, back to you, and maybe speaking a little bit to Datavant. So the question here is, are there any other tokenization technologies in the market other than Datavant? If so, would these different tokenization technologies work with each other to match patients across different sources?
Great. Again, tokenization is essentially a way to link different data sets in a privacy-preserving record linkage way. There's a couple of technologies out there in order to be able to do so, but at the core of them, again, they all work more or less by ensuring that the certain underlying PII is the same in both places. The beauty of Datavant's technology is that it's already installed and being used right now in over 500 different data sources, including many of the first-party data assets that pharma sponsors have, such as clinical trials, specialty pharma data, sponsored genetic testing, and other data sources. So we have the capability to provide linkage across a wide and deep variety of different data. In terms of interoperability with other types of tokenization, so Datavant has partnerships with other token data sources where there's either bridges or dual tokenization that can happen as well. The goal here is, again, to Ivy's point, to ensure that there is linkage and interoperability across various different data sets to get to as complete as possible of insights that you can get.
Thank you for that. All right, so I'm going to jump to you, Ivy. So there's a question here around social determinants of health. So the question here is, how can this new offering help us understand the social determinants of health and also help us mitigate some of these risk factors? Could you maybe share some thoughts on that?
It's known that patients face numerous social determinants of health that ultimately impact their care outcomes. So over 1/3 of screening eligible patients are out of reach of conventional site locations. By investing in the infrastructure to measure and mitigate socioeconomic disparities, we can achieve more equitable outcomes. So by tokenizing the data, we can better understand the gaps in care as it relates to clinical trials and take proactive measures to address where we're selecting sites, how we're selecting patients, and also removing barriers to, for these patients.
Thank you for that, Ivy. So now we're gonna take a little bit of a pause and break with an audience participation poll. So we've been taking questions for a bit now, but please feel free to continue to submit your questions. We appreciate that there are multiple use cases that this offering and this technology can enable, and we only went over 2 of them in our case studies. So we're curious what the audience would love to learn more about. I think this will really help us in following up with you after this webinar. So please take some time to answer this poll, and then we'll continue to get back into your great questions. All right. So a lot of interest in the external control arm piece, optimizing protocol study design, which all makes sense. Social determinants of health, which we just addressed. Long-term follow-up for commercial differentiation. Fantastic. Okay, I think some of the use cases we talked about actually resonated with these, and there's some others that we can definitely speak to in follow-up. So thank you for your participation. All right, let's get back into the questions. So I'm going to pose this to both of you, Open, Vera, and Ivy, to see whoever wants to take this one. So this question is around advice for a sponsor CRO. So how do you advise a sponsor CRO to address the consent piece during the clinical trial when the secondary objectives might be purely commercial? Maybe example, patient finding. I don't know if either of you want to take that one.
I'll go first. I think one of the things that I've seen in terms of the consent asking question is thinking about sort of why the trial participant is usually deciding to be part of a clinical trial. And in many cases is to help support drugs coming to market and to help support learning new insights about science. Certainly, my recommendation would be to provide the information in the informed consent about what type of research questions that you're trying to answer. In many cases, actually, most sponsors do tokenization as a way to ensure that they can link to other data and that they can answer questions. And often they might not even know exactly what kinds of questions that they would ask. So I've seen folks put together a list of things that could be asked either. So like for being able to learn about the drug more in the real world, for being able to see how that intervention compares to others, which might be a commercial type of use case, and for better contextualizing any sort of safety or efficacy effects. So I would put a couple of examples in the informed consent about what a patient is essentially consenting for their de-identified data research to be used for. But I think the one thing that I would underscore is, again, the privacy preservation. As a patient, and we've seen sort of like surveys in literature quite a bit addressing this, as a patient, patients are more likely to allow for their data to be linkable and to be used for secondary research if they know that their privacy is being protected, if they know that this information is not going to be used in any way that could potentially harm them in the future. So certainly as you're working with your CROs about the informed consent, ensuring that there is a line in there or some information around how this is done in a de-identified way per HIPAA, I think would be something that I would recommend.
Thank you for that, Vera. So Ivy, over to you. Actually, HIPAA's come up. So the question directly to you, Ivy, is can you speak to how Komodo's solution is HIPAA compliant? Can you share some thoughts on that?
At Komodo Health, all of our information has been fully de-identified, and we've also obtained a statistical certification for this large and flexible schema. And this de-identified data set that we have does not contain PHI, so IRB approval is not required. whenever we bring in disparate data sets, so we're linking to labs, EMR, and also the first party clinical trial data, we handle the statistical certification of this newly linked asset for our clients to ensure a seamless experience.
Thank you for that. And still on you, Ivy. So I think this is a top line question here, but please share some of your thoughts. What are some of the challenges you're seeing your clinical development customers face in strategizing and executing clinical trials? I'm curious if you can speak to some of that and maybe where you see real world data helping out.
Clinical trials are time consuming, they're very expensive and very burdensome on patients, and they can also fail for many, many reasons. So I think one, study site selection is an important aspect of the clinical trial process. Poor choices often lead directly to study failure or additional study sites, amended protocols, and the need to build different subgroups of patient populations receiving different treatment regimens, which are costly just in time and also opportunity cost. So second, trying to minimize patient burden is key. A lot of our clients are working with us to employ methods using real world data to ensure that the study populations are relevant to the real world population that is intended to benefit from treatment. So that eligibility criteria, inclusion, exclusion should be reviewed carefully. And then lastly, adapting to new trial complexities. So enabling them to make better decisions, data-driven decisions, all increase probabilities of success and these are opportunities to implement innovations for efficient trials.
Thank you, Ivy. Okay, Vera, back to you. So this question is about tokenization. So about tokenization being done in a certified way, are you following any international standards? Are you following any international standards as far as your tokenization technology goes?
Again, thank you for all of these questions. I love that the audience is actually interested in all of the operational considerations here. So I wanted to step back a little bit and first of all recognize that a lot of clinical trials are international. There's US sites, there's sites ex-US as well. But the concept of certified de-identified data is a very US specific type of concept because it pertains to HIPAA regulations around privacy and around healthcare data use for secondary research. So first I wanted to define what we mean when we say certified tokens. So a certifier or an expert determination process is a way to ensure that any data set is considered de-identified and there's a very low risk of re-identification of those patients as the setup is defined by HIPAA. So when you think about the Datavant tokens, even the token itself, that patient 123, patient 456 that I'm talking about, the token itself is certified as de-identified. There's no way to go from that token to the person's identity. When we're thinking about how these tokens are used to link large data assets, such as Komodo's healthcare map, that healthcare map is also de-identified per HIPAA. So all of the connections in there, any sort of like potentially quasi-identifiers or other information that could lead to an identification risk is taken care of, and the whole data set is certified. So in the US, there's a lot of real world data that sort of gets linked and is used for research this way. The concept of de-identification is not the same or doesn't particularly have a cognate in Europe under GDPR or in other locations. So when we think about real world data and linkages in Europe, certainly the token could be used as a technology to link data, but we need to actually think about what we're linking to. So are there certain de-identified or in the case of GDPR, pseudonymized data sets that you can link to? The technology itself is easy and straightforward, but I think what we need to think about when we're talking about supporting international trials is what are we linking to? How is the data being generated? Where is the data being stored? You know, the regulations in Germany are different from the regulations in Italy, et cetera, et cetera. So as you're thinking about tokenizing trials that might be international, I would actually recommend that you start first with your US-based population. And then if you really want to connect and do research on other type of populations, think about which real world data assets you want to link to, and let's have the conversations around how that could work. But I would say if we're thinking about sort of technical feasibility and operational feasibility today, think about your US data. And I don't know if that answers the question directly, but that's how I would operationalize it.
Thank you, Vera. Ivy, back to you, and maybe a question that's following the case study you shared around external control arm. So when using real world data as an external control arm or part of an external control arm, is there there a consent process in place to use the data for those patients in the trial? So a question around consent, I guess, as it pertains to real world data and an external control arm.
That's a good question. When we build an external control arm, it's also using the fully de-identified patient lives in Komodo's healthcare map. Patients' consent is not needed to de-identify their PHI. As per HIPAA's de-identification standards, it constitutes independent permission to de-identify under the privacy rule. So the privacy rule also does not restrict the use or disclosure of the information. With Komodo's statistical certification, we ensure that there's no risk of re-identification for these patients, which is why when we use RWD to build the external control arm, there's no consent process required to use this data.
Thank you for that. Okay, so I think we're going to go broad, high-level question here. So I'll pose this to both of you, Ivy and Vera. So pretty general here, but would love some of your thoughts. What trends in technology are you seeing reshape the clinical development landscape? So I'll pose that to both you, Ivy and Vera, and see whoever wants to go first.
I think the ecosystem for executing clinical trials continues to evolve and change. We're becoming truly more patient-centric by building infrastructure and technologies to support direct-to-patient logistics. So we're actually building a trial around the patient and providing all of the retention services to them, which I think is a trend that we're seeing across the market.
And in my end, actually, I think a lot about, could trial tokenization be done 10 years ago, for example? When we talk about sort of the technical feasibility, maybe. When we talk about what's to link to, again, this real world data that is fit for purpose for clinical research, that is connected, that is as complete as possible, today is the time where that is actually possible and feasible. So as we're thinking about sort of the analytics that can be generated from Komodo's data, when you're asking research grade questions, you want to make sure that you're doing so with as high of a confidence as possible and with as limited availability of bias in the process. So you want to make sure that any confounders are either sort of researched on or are taken account of or removed as much as possible. And I would say having complete real world data to do this work is I would say probably the thing that has changed the most in the past few years and the thing that has made it feasible. Even if you look at FDA guidance around how real world data can be used for regulatory decision making, this idea of data being fit for purpose, this idea of data being complete is very important. The one example that I love to think about being a cancer researcher is oncology trials. We want to get life-saving drugs out in the market as soon as possible. So the clinical trial cannot run for 5 or 10 years, right? But you also need to make sure that the endpoints that are really, really valuable for your cancer patients are taken into account. And overall survival is one of those endpoints that is kind of gold standard in oncology. The clinical trial itself might have some secondary, some surrogate endpoints and still get the drug approved and in market. But when you're thinking about overall survival, you want to link to mortality data. You can only have confidence in those survival curves if the mortality data on the back end is as complete as possible. Similarly, if you have some other endpoints where you're looking at duration of response, you want to make sure that in your claims, your EHR, your labs data sets, you have all of the information. And these data need to be as complete as possible. So when I think about sort of the overall question, what trends have changed in the clinical trial to allow for real world data to be used to extend the utility of a clinical trial, I think data completeness is one of those things that has really changed the game. And I'm really excited for the next decade and then what's to come in that regard.
I'm equally excited. I think there's so much that can be unlocked here, and it's fantastic. We're living in this time. So Vera's gonna keep you on the seat here with answering this next question. I love your thoughts here. So maybe might be pertaining to some underlying use cases. The question is, there's so much talk about increasing clinical trial enrollment with this connected technology, so much talk. But how are these patients identified if the tokenization removes this data? So I'm curious if you have any thoughts here, maybe speaking to some of the different use cases.
So there's certain use cases that can be supported with de-identified data and certain ones that cannot, to be honest. So if you're looking for a case study where you need to re-identify the patient, reach out back to the patient, de-identified data is probably not the right option there. There's other ways to be able to do so by having the patient, for example, authorize their full medical record to be brought into the clinical trial in an identified way. When we're thinking about where de-identified data can make the enrollment process easier, and I'll perhaps pass this on to Ivy because I know you're an expert there, is around the site feasibility question. If you have data that sort of oversees the entire US population and you really want to find where patients that might be sort of either underserved or underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed, or who might be diagnosed but really don't have the right tools in place to improve their care, looking at de-identified data at the population level can help you figure out where those hotspots are, either where certain physicians might be treating your patients or where those patients are being seen. So Ivy, I don't know if you have any other comments around how site improvement can help accelerate enrollment.
Yeah. I think oftentimes when we're selecting the right sites from the get-go, where we're actually seeing patients with disease burden, we're engaging the providers that are treating these patients and also doing clinical trials and understanding how these sites are operating with all of the trials under their purview, we're able to route patients to the right sites, seeing the right providers, and that really accelerates patient accrual. And that all begins with picking the right sites.
Thank you both. So last call for questions. We're coming up to the top of the hour, and also want to give people time to run off to their next meetings or grab some food, because I appreciate this is lunchtime, at least during on the East Coast side. So maybe Ivy, this open question to you. Could you speak to how, again, Datavant and Komodo are actively working together today and moving forward to deploy this new offering?
Yeah, we're really excited for this next phase of our partnership with Datavant. We're already partnering with Datavant across numerous fronts, linking clinical trial data with real-world data, second, patient finding for rare disease, understanding disease burden, and also for commercial intelligence, where we're linking all of the different data assets within Datavant's marketplace and linking that using the Datavant token. So with the tokenization technology, Komodo's platform has been supporting clinical development teams to unlock the value of real-world evidence to increase health equity in site selection, improving speed of recruitment, and also supporting research to reduce the burden of disease. Using Datavant's portals and tokens, once the clinical trial is tokenized, these tokens are immediately transferred to Komodo Health for us to do the linking to our healthcare map. And this unlocks the reality of linking RCTs to real-world data for the use cases that we described around long-term safety and follow-up. So in addition, we can augment this data with other sources of data like labs and EMR data points.
Thank you for that, Ivy. So I'll open it up to the two of you for any last remarks as we wrap up today. Definitely want to thank you all for attending today's webinar. Please feel free to reach out to any of us. Direct emails for Ivy and Vera you can see on the screen. If you have any additional follow-up questions, if you'd like to connect with us to learn more about Datavant, about Komodo, about this exciting new offering that's available today for your ongoing trials, for your completed trials, to really begin to unlock richer insights before, during, and after clinical trials. So thank you so much for attending. And we're going to wrap up with maybe Vera, you first, if you want to share any last remarks, and then we'll throw it over to Ivy for any closing comments.
Thanks, Kwame. So again, thank you very much for your attendance and your attention and great questions today. Hopefully, the takeaway here is that Komodo and Datavant and our partnership is making it more feasible and more possible to really extend the insights from the clinical trial into the real world. So we talked about the operational pieces. We seeded a few use cases that we've seen in the market out there, but ultimately it's up to you and the research questions that you all have, and what do you think that real world data connectivity can help really turbocharge in your clinical trials? So we want to hear from you. So email us, let's set up conversations. Let's talk about your particular trial, your protocol, the research questions that you want to answer. And we're pretty confident that the real world data connectivity can help there. But I urge you all to think about those use cases and then share them with us.
And thank you all so much for your time. Please feel free to reach out to Vera or myself through email, LinkedIn. We're open to hearing your questions, your needs, and happy to chat more around, how we can operationalize this for all of your clinical trials and which data sets are fit for purpose for different therapeutic areas, different indications, and different studies.
Fantastic. And again, I'll wrap up by saying thank you all again for attending. This was pretty exciting. Really appreciate all the engagement, and definitely looking forward to partnering with you all as we explore this underlying technology and offering. Again, there's so much that can be unlocked here with generating richer insights. And I'll wrap up by saying the 5,500 clinical trials that were started this year are ripe for that. And as we discussed, even the ones that are completed can still benefit from this. So looking forward to staying engaged with you all, and appreciate your time for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy your lunch if you're about to grab lunch, and definitely reach out to us if you have any questions or follow-ups. Thank you all.